It's a privilege to have this opportunity to address this group, and I am equally keen and keenly looking forward to joining ISID. And as you can see, I have already started focusing attention on industrial transformation of India, which is the key mandate of ISID. And that is what I'm going to talk about today. Strategic interventions for industrial transformation of India, what we can learn from experiences of especially the East Asian countries like Japan, Korea, China, Taiwan, which have become extremely successful in exploiting the potential of structural transformation focused on building manufacturing capacities. I have also written on this theme in a couple of papers, which I will be happy to share after the session with all the participants through the Secretariat, Shailendra and
Yes.
Rama. So you will get those papers by email. So I have put together some material in this presentation based on those papers. And one of them actually appeared in EPW in December only, just December 2020. And the other one was in the book uh, published 2 years ago in honor of Professor Deepak Nair. I'm sure you know Professor Deepak Nair. So in 2018, a book was published in his honor. And so I had written a paper in that book on industrialization. So this presentation draws upon uh, these two, but some other material over time I have been producing. So I don't think what is on this slide needs to be elaborated with this group, because you are teaching economics and you know that structural transformation is the key to development, especially development uh, which involves diversification of economic structure from the one dominated by primary activities like agriculture to sectors that are having greater labor productivity like industry and services. So you move from primary or agriculture based economy to secondary and tertiary activities where productivity is higher. And in that process, which is called structural transformation, we prosper, we get more jobs and higher value addition, higher productivity, and that is the secret of development. Then there is a quote I have summarized of Nicholas Kaldor of 1967, who had said that few countries, if at all, have achieved prosperity without industrialization. And the few countries he included, that those did not have to industrialize to prosper, are highly resource rich countries like Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. All others, any country that has become prosperous by or through industrialization. And in recent times, you may have heard of Sustainable Development Goals. This is an agenda comprising 17 Sustainable Development Goals uh, adopted by the 197 members of United Nations. It was adopted in 2015, and that agenda of Sustainable Development Goals recognizes the transformative and job creating potential of industrialization. So, uh, but when you think about India, we have had very substantial structural transformation over the past 50 years, but it has been a structural transformation of very distorted type, in the sense that although share of uh, agriculture has gone down, and if you look at this figure on the right hand side on the screen, how share of agriculture has dramatically fallen from over 50% in 1950-51 to under 15%, 15%, in recent times. So there is a structural transformation. We have moved away from low value adding, low productivity sectors like agriculture. However, we have bypassed the manufacturing sector. So share of manufacturing in GDP is under 15%. It is around 30% in East Asian countries. So we have not been able to make a mark in the manufacturing. And what is worse is that since 1997, share of manufacturing in GDP has actually come down. It has been declining. And so what has happened is that agriculture as a activity, economic activity that has come down from 50 to 15%, but it has been contributed increasingly more. The GDP of India has been contributed by services rather than industry. And services account for over 55, 56% of India's GDP. However, uh, you know, this sector, which has given very good growth to India, services have been at the core of dynamism of Indian economy, have not been able to create jobs in the same proportion. So, as a result, agriculture continues to sustain over 50% of India's population for livelihood purposes. So, this is the basic reason for persistence of poverty in India, that a sector which accounts for only 15%, 15% of GDP, or, hosts or provides livelihood to nearly 50% of the workforce, which means productivity and earnings obviously are low. So what we need to do is to move such a large proportion of people to more creative, more productive jobs, more decent jobs that can, help them to realize their full potential. And if we look at the job creating potential of different sectors in the economy, you will find that manufacturing sector has maximum job creating potential if you include both direct and indirect jobs. As you know, manufacturing activity creates or generates a lot of forward and backward linkages. So it generates a lot of demand for other sectors like logistics. Some people will be engaged in transporting raw materials to the factory. Some people will be engaged in transporting the finished products from the factory. Some people will be engaged in distribution of the output of the factory, and vice versa. So, a lot of indirect jobs are created. So, per unit of investment, you get maximum jobs created in manufacturing compared to all other sectors. So the other thing, I was saying is that share of manufacturing actually has come down since the peak of 1997 in India. So I was asking a question whether Indian economy has been de-industrializing prematurely. And so what I did was to look at the uh, shares of imports in final consumption using input-output tables over time. So 2001, 2006, 2011. And this is a calculation which is reported in the paper I published in Professor Deepak Nair volume, the uh, 2018 volume. So I use input-output tables to compute the share of imports in final consumption in select manufacturing sectors. And you find that import dependence or share of imports in final consumption has gone up in major industries that account for very large proportion of total GDP or industrial output, chemicals and chemical products, the basic metals and fabricated metals, machinery from 5.9% to 15%, electrical and optical equipment 20 to 52%. So in transport sector also it is increased from 0.5% to 4.7%. So Indian economy or it has been de-industrializing. This is a finding which is consistent with other studies. There are two I have listed. One is Amir Apu and Arvind Subramaniam, who was India's chief economist, chief economic advisor some years ago. So they have used different methods to arrive at a conclusion that India has been deindustrializing. Now, Danny Roderick, in his 2015 paper, has talked about that deindustrialization is a kind of a pattern, a stylized fact. When countries cross the US dollar 5,500 in 1990 dollars of per capita GDP. But India GDP per capita GDP is under $3,000. So if it is happening in India, we can surely call it a premature deindustrialization. I mean, if it was happening after India has crossed $5,500 per capita GDP, then it would be fitting in a pattern. Global pattern is that once you reach certain level of prosperity, because wages begin to rise, so share of industry begins to decline and services catch up from there. So that is not happening in India. In India, we are deindustrializing before that threshold level is reached. So this is a conclusion which we get from different studies, including my own based on input-output tables. Now, what is happening? Why India has been deindustrializing? So this is on the slide. I have put 3, 4 regions explaining this. One was the trade liberalization, especially withdrawal of quantitative restrictions on imports, which were phased out in 2000. And that suddenly exposed India to international competition, international markets. And we'll talk about later that Indian industry, although was producing most of the things that we consume, was not internationally competitive because of different objectives of the policy followed earlier. And that uh, exposure to international competition after import licensing was withdrawn affected some of it. So imports started to come. The other was that IT hardware industry, which came up in India. And I remember working with computers made in India in 1980s. But in 2000 onwards, India signed this information technology agreement of WTO, under which all duties on IT products were to be removed, and without any import restrictions, and tariffs on imports, this agreement entailed, a lot of local industries simply wiped out, simply stopped producing. So today, you can't buy any computer which is made in India. They are all imported, or at least assembled, at the most assembled, not made in India. The other were some free trade agreements with East Asian countries. There also, whatever little tariffs that we had were removed, and East Asian countries have become very efficient and competitive producers of goods, and we will talk about that. And so that also did not help. If, but major trend, which I think explains this is a hollowing out effect of Indian industry, where the established Indian producers of several goods relocated the manufacturer or subcontracted the manufacture of their output to outside India to take advantage of the appreciation of rupee. So I have in a figure on the bottom of this slide, we showed how Indian rupee has appreciated, and that makes it more competitive, cheaper to get it manufactured in other countries and import and sell, putting your brand name. So you would ask why Indian rupee is appreciating when we are running, uh, you know, f- uh, current account deficits on a sustainable basis. I mean, successively we have been running current account deficits, so Indian exchange rate should be declining, depreciating. Why it is appreciating? This is a good question. And the explanation or answer of that is in rising short-term capital flows. We opened our, stock markets to short-term capital flows by FIIs, FIIs, foreign institutional investors, who bring the pension funds, money, deposits, and all that to Indian stock markets to benefit from the volatility. They make big returns at the Indian stock market because, as an emerging market, the potential of India to grow and make money in Indian markets is recognized widely. So they come and invest in India. And so, as a result, the rupee has been appreciating in real terms, which makes it more competitive, more cost effective for Indian companies to produce in other countries like China. I generally tend to give an example of a toaster. You can name any simple electric product, and toaster is the simplest. It is just a heating coil on two sides, which is used to uh, just a minute. I think not my phone. Somebody. I'm sorry. There's a phone ringing. So yeah. So I was giving an example of some electric item like a toaster, simplest of them. And in the 1980s, in the 1990s, you had plenty of locally made toasters. But now, if you go to buy in one of these stores, you will buy Bajaj or Murphy or whatever brand name you are used to, but they will all be made in China, you know, except for one or two brands. So there is a same Indian company brand name, but the product is made in China. So this is what has happened, and this is the phenomena I call as hollowing out of Indian industry. That the brand names, locally recognized brand names, are on the products, but the products are not made in India. So this is something which is one of the key regions of deindustrialization, premature deindustrialization of Indian economy. So now, if we were to reverse the trend, and you know about Make in India program and Atmanirbhar Bharat, so government is seriously trying to reverse this trend of uh, you know uh, the premature deindustrialization by producing within the country, and the competitive local production will have to be supported by local market. So scale economies will have to be provided to them by giving them preferred access to the domestic market. And there, the examples or successful experiences of East Asian countries can be a very good guide for India to exploit. And while the uh, prospects of export-oriented industrialization may appear to be not so bright in the current context where international trade or world trade has collapsed in the context of COVID. But even before COVID, because of the rising protectionism in advanced economies and other things, world trade actually never quite recovered from the global financial crisis. So the subdued growth of advanced economies has become a new normal, and that has implications for world trade. So there are, limitations of talking about export-oriented industrialization in the at the current juncture, but someday that will be revived. The potential of global trade, etc., will be revived, and one can do, export-oriented production as well. But until then, India has a very substantial domestic market, and so if you look at the imports of key manufactured products, you find that for machinery, electronic goods, electrical machinery, transport equipment, manufacture of metals, chemicals, artificial agents, all of them, the substantial imports are taking place. There are projections by Electronics Industry Association that in a few years, India may be importing $400 billion of electronics again, electronics alone, and power equipment, or telecom equipment, the phones, So a huge amount of imports taking place. If we were to provide all of that market to domestic industry, it could support uh, a, scale intensive, local manufacturing, which can be competitive. So, and but that requires a very heavy hand of state intervention, and the state intervention or strategic interventions for developing manufacturing sector, there is a very significant theoretical underpinning of strategic interventions to build industry, which have been there for a long time. But in the last few decades, I mean, since 1990, industrial policy became a bad word, and we started to shun, we started to roll back the import substituting industrialization, and industrial policy nobody was talking about. However, in the recent times, in the last decade or so, there is a revival of industrial policy all across the world, including in the United States, the biggest champion of liberalization and globalization. Now, what are the theoretical underpinnings for state intervention for building manufacturing sector? You have heard of Frederick List, who in the 1909, as early as 1909, built an argument for infant industry protection, which was used by the United States to impose high tariffs, very high tariffs in the beginning of the previous century. The same argument of infant industry protection was used to justify a new chapter on trade and development in General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in 1960s. And then this was the argument, the infant industry protection argument, which was used by East Asian countries to develop, the state intervention through developmental state. Then more recently, there is the Brander and Spencer, this strategic trade policy, which justified state intervention, showing in the certain conditions that it could be welfare enhancing, shifting profits from international firms to domestic firms. And a lot of market failures in the technological development or innovation activity. So every country in the world supports local technological development, because of those market failures. And I can come to that in the discussion maybe. And of late, this Chinese economist, Justin Yifu Lin, he was World Bank's chief economist, before Koshi Basu. He has written a lot on new structural economics, which is justifying the role of state or state interventions for manufacturing development. So now coming to what have East Asian countries done and to successfully industrialize themselves, several things, and I will spend some time to share some of their experiences. Firstly, they have used heterodox policies. They have been a mix of, some of the liberal and some of the interventionist policies. So they haven't been wedded to any ideology that markets are good or states are good for industrial development. They have evolved a mix of both state and markets working in, in a complementary manner, supporting each other rather than either state or markets. They have coordinated policies across sectors and over time to adjust the emphasis, according to the needs. And the extensive state intervention has been documented in Japan, Republic of Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, China, and Vietnam. And we will go through some of those lessons. So what did it entail? So there are 4, 5, or 6 areas of intervention that I have listed, and I will share with you. There are many others, but key ones are these. So, for instance, using trade and exchange rate management in a very strategic manner and not in a passive manner. The argument, neoclassical argument, which you often hear, is that trade is an engine of growth, and that is, you know, sort of defined in terms of that you liberalize your trade policy, and that is good for economic growth. But this is not borne out by the evidence. So, what did East Asian countries do? They followed a much more calibrated, very nuanced, uh, strategic integration with the world economy rather than just passively opening, just passively liberalize everything, and so you get it. So they followed an industrial policy and they calibrated the opening to world trade uh, with this industrial policy. So, for instance, some of them followed a dualism in trade policy, especially China. They were restrictive for imports but open for exports. So, best of both worlds, so to say. They managed exchange rates. Japan was heavily managing exchange rates when a dollar used to be equal to 380 yen. And so, because Japan was exporting cheap goods to every country, the developed countries became very concerned, and United States forced Japan to come to the negotiating table to restrain the cheap yen or the undervalued exchange rate. This was an accord called Plaza Accord because it took place in a Plaza Hotel in New York in 1985. Since then, there has been a kind of restraint on Japanese yen's exchange rate, and you know that in the last 10, 15 years, Japanese yen has hovered around 100 yen to a dollar. It goes up, down a little bit, but around 100. It used to be 380 or more yen per dollar before Plaza Accord. Republic of Korea has very extensively rationed foreign exchange in the early years of industrialization when they were still developing their manufacturing capacities. China's case is highly, documented. They had a dual exchange rate initially, one applicable for imports, which will make imports very expensive. Another applicable to exports, which will make exports very cheap and competitive. Then they moved to a managed float in 1984. Then they pegged their exchange rate with dollar so that yuan cannot appreciate. Then they were forced by the economy or world community to, when they were running trade surpluses on a sustained basis, they were brought to a negotiating table and they were forced to float yuan, but they agreed to do or float it only to move within a very narrow band, 2.5% plus or minus. So it moves very, in a very small band and remains very undervalued. The other thing which they have used extensively is using both import substitution and export promotion to exploit scale economies. They needed to build scales, massive scales. So their domestic market should be available to domestic manufacturers, but also the international markets, so that they can produce at a very large scale. So they combine the elements of import substitution and export promotion although the emphasis had changed over time. It has been calibrated. So, for instance, Malaysia, import substitution during 1950s and 60s, then switching over to export orientation in 1970s, then 1981 onwards, import substitution again on based focused on heavier industries, followed by export orientation. So there is a nuance position. Build local capacities through import substitution, expose it to export promotion orientation, then again, fill the gaps and all. Republic of Korea, they started with the, you know, heavy and chemical industrialization uh, in 1973 and infant industry protection until 1980. The third thing I want to talk about and share with you, this is also again very extensively documented, which is a selective approach to improve quality of FDI. Quality of FDI, incidentally, is a term that I coined in a 2002 book, which was published by Oxford University Press. Its title is Globalization and the Quality of Foreign Direct Investment, because I try to argue that all foreign direct investments are not same. They vary in terms of their direct and indirect effects on the host government or host country. And so the quality which is used to capture direct and indirect effects of foreign direct investment should be as much a concern of a policymaker as the quantity of foreign direct investment is. So you know that all different finance ministers of developing countries try to get as much as foreign direct investment as they can. But my argument was that you should target quality foreign direct investments, not just all foreign direct investment, because quality indeed varies greatly. Anyhow, coming to the East Asian example, they have really been very concerned to improve quality of FDI inflows or to attract FDI that helps them really and not any FDI. So, first of all, some of these countries like Japan, Republic of Korea, and Taiwan have put greater reliance on non-equity modes or restricted FDI, for instance. So they needed some technologies, they needed some patent licensing. So they entered into collaborations with, you know, major multinational companies for technology licensing, managerial and technical assistance. For instance, Republic of Korea built world-class steel and shipbuilding industries, drawing upon the technology from Nippon Steel and Kawasaki shipbuilding. They also established special economic zones and export processing zones to leverage foreign direct investment for export capabilities. Like Korea, established one of the first special economic zone or export processing zone to direct, FDI in those zones. So they want to develop some export capability, let foreign direct investment come and be housed in that export processing zone. Let us not bother in the rest of domestic, tariff area. So that has also been exploited. China, on the other hand, has been engaged with multinational companies in strategic bargaining. They realize that they have built, a very sophisticated infrastructure which appeals to multinational companies. They also realize that they have very large domestic market. So let us sit on the table, with a multinational company and bargain. So they would ask, okay, you want to have access to our domestic market? We will give it to you, provided you take 50% export commitment. So 50% access to market, domestic market, and 50% export commitment. So they forced multinational companies to locate in the country, but they have to take export obligations. And and when you do export obligation or you are producing for export, obviously you will set up a large plant, mass manufacturing, costs will come down, and you will be, very much clear that you need to be competitive because otherwise you can't export. So, so it worked very well for them, and they, proactively also targeted foreign investors. They would identify. Now, for instance, they want to produce solar, cells. This, silicon chips or cells, for which huge investments are needed to set up a fab, what is called as fab. So they will select who are the key companies in the world owning this technology. Invite them for a discussion. We want you to set up a manufacturing plant in China, and this is what we can offer to you. You tell us what you need. So that was proactive targeting was another way of getting them. Favorable tax treatment of foreign investors. So much so that even domestic investments went out of China to come back and register as foreign investors through Hong Kong and all. So there were these policies which China used to get foreign direct investment of the right type, which will help China build capacities for producing for exports. And so there is no surprise that China became the global factory, or to produce all kinds of things, and are largely produced by foreign companies, and they are given access by the Chinese government. The East Asian countries also employed performance requirements on foreign direct investment very extensively, and they, using these performance requirements, and I will give a case study or an example of what kind of things were done. But they managed to strategically make sure that the possibilities of foreign direct investment coming in the country and destroying domestic investment or crowd out domestic investment were avoided. So they ensure that when foreign direct investment comes, it complements domestic investment. It helps to fold in, crowd in more domestic investment rather than crowd out. So I have an empirical study of 110 countries across the world, and I estimated some production functions to see whether domestic investment was crowded out when foreign investment came, or it was crowded in, more foreign investment, more domestic investment. And you find clearly for East Asian countries, it was a pattern of crowd in, but in some of the South Asian countries like India, it was foreign investors came and they drove out some domestic investment. So we could not manage FDI in India in the same manner as East Asian countries. Now, coming to the case study of the yeah how some of the East Asian countries used these performance requirements in a manner that helps them to build local capacity of competitive type. Thailand, for instance, is the third largest exporter of automobiles, or the cars, in Asia, after Japan and Korea. How did it happen? And they don't have any local manufacturers. I mean, there is no indigenous industry. It's a Toyota and Honda that have huge manufacturing plants in Thailand, producing for exports and domestic. How did it? How did they do it? In the 1970s, they invited Toyota and Honda to establish local manufacturing plants. They impose local content requirements that you have to produce the components also within the country. And once the local capacities were built up, they started imposing export performance requirements since the mid 80s to hook up to the global production networks. Now they realize that Toyota and Honda are there. They are globally integrated companies. They have marketing networks extending to all different countries. So we started pushing them to now export from here. Now that you have been producing, now begin to export. So as a result, Thailand has become a global production base for Toyota pickup trucks and Honda City for Japan. And in 2014, I had the numbers of export. They exported 1.2 million dollar worth of 1.2 million vehicles worth 30 billion dollars. In 2014, and of course, more recent figures will show perhaps more exports. The fourth thing that they did in East Asia was, the enterprise development and national champions, building local companies, local champions that carry your industrialization, that carry your brand names, that carry your expansion. So they supported selected firms. They identified who are the best, most capable companies which have potential to grow into larger ones. And so they identified them and supported them to nurture their capacities, scales, build up scales, build brand names, and global operations. So Republic of Korea and Taiwan, they had this policy of promoting chaebols, which are basically highly diversified, conglomerates which produce all different things. You have heard of Samsung, LG, Foxconn. So because they have very large scale of operation, the scale economies they are able to exploit and keep the costs low. They also favored fierce innovation-based rivalry between the national champions in order to enhance their competitiveness. So while they are not exposed to imports, but they between themselves compete all the time. And so you see a very tough competition between Samsung and LG, for instance, in TVs, in the mobile phones. Also, you will find the competition between them. China, on the other hand, facilitated mergers of state-owned enterprises to create large-scale enterprises. So Korea and Taiwan developed, chaebols. China allowed mergers of state-owned enterprises to create very large companies. The idea was same. They wanted scales, they wanted volumes to bring costs down, per unit cost of production down. And they were helped, these national champions and these companies, chaebols or whatever it is, were supported extensively through public procurement programs and public investments. So whenever there is a public procurement, government is building some infrastructure or roads or highways or railways, they will only procure from these national champions, nobody else, as simple as that. So So next step uh, you know, was the credit, directed credit, subsidized credit to the champions and companies. So in that process, they needed an institutional architecture. So they created national development banks. Through these banks, they pushed a lot of credit, subsidized credit to uh, where they wanted to deliver it. So Republic of Korea, for instance, established National Investment Fund in 1973 that accounted, just to give you an idea of the scale of their operations, 70% of all manufacturing based lending in 1970s was through this National Investment Fund, you know. So they were really pumping huge amount of subsidized credit to the companies that they wanted to support. In China, there was no cost of capital. So capital was free to all state enterprises before 1978. After 1978, the China Development Bank was established, which incidentally is one of the biggest in the world. You know, it's bigger than World Bank, for instance. The share of loans in GDP, share of loans given to industry in GDP, again, to give you an idea of the importance of these banks and subsidized credit, you know, share of these loans in GDP rose from 2% in 1994 to 13% in 2016 in China. Similarly, in Malaysia, they created 13 national development banks, and the share of loans in GDP rising from 4 to 11%. They also had pioneer industry programs, and they had extensive, subsidies on top of that, and tax incentives for sunrise industries. So, coming to the next, that was building domestic technological capacity through public funding and soft intellectual property rights. So, Korea, Taiwan, China, and all others have followed very similar kind of tracks, and I have some examples for you. Uh, in Korea, as early as in 1960s, they created a very powerful science and technology agency in Prime Minister's office, besides a network of government research institutions which are very famous by now, like Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. In Taiwan, the Industrial Technology Research Institute, ITRI, was set up in 1973, which had 10,000 scientists working for it by early 1990s. There is no such thing in India, 10,000 scientists. Do you have any institution? No. So China, they had been setting up or establishing programs every 5 years. Very massive funding, very clear cut target and missions. For instance, in 2006, they had a program called Medium and Long Term Program of Science and Technology, which funded 16 mega projects in strategic industries like aerospace, automobile, semiconductor, this and that. 10 to 2010, Strategic Emerging Industries Program focusing on 20 strategic industries to enhance their share in GDP to 8% in by 2015 and 15% by 2020. And these strategic industries are, electronics, telecom equipment, power generation equipment, and you see that how they have come up in these sectors. In 2015, they launched Made in India 2025 initiative to enhance local content of core components. So they realized that we have started to export started to produce and export number of these equipment. However, local content was not so high. So they wanted to enhance local content in core components to 70% by 2025. And so they are pumping huge amount of resources in building these capacities. East Asian countries have also used soft IPR laws, intellectual property rights regimes, to foster local technological capacity. So, for instance, Japan did not recognize any product patents till mid 70s. Korea did not recognize them till mid 1980s, and China till 2002. What does it mean? It means that since product patents are not recognized in my country, so any company, Japanese, Korean, or Chinese, is free to steal anybody's technology because nobody's patent is recognized in my country. Okay, so it helped in building capacity through reverse engineering. So you find somebody's, drug or chemical produced by somebody in the United States, bring it over, see how it can be produced, and just produce. No need to bother about any patents. They also encourage utility models or petty patents to encourage incremental innovations. The MSMEs do small, improvements, and they will be destroyed by big companies coming. Hey, this is what I have innovated. You don't know, so you keep out of. But using these patents or utility models, they gave them protections to these MSMEs for doing some incremental innovations, and that built their capacity over time. The final thing I want to talk about is, and there are many other things or nuances, but what I was saying earlier, that what you see in the policies adopted by East Asian countries is pragmatism and adaptability. That it was a dynamic setting. It was not a static setting. That we have import substituting industrialization adopted in 1960s, and there is no change for next 20, 30 years. So they moved every decade, depending upon their comparative advantage and situation. So, for instance, Korea started with focus on labor-intensive products like toys in 1960s. In 70s, when wages started to rise, they shifted the focus on new emerging industries like automobiles and electronics. China has done the same. They started with the labor-intensive goods in 1980s, garments, toys, leather goods. But in 1990s onwards, they started to move to technology-intensive goods, in the last 2 decades. And so mobile phones, for instance, are one of their biggest exports these days, or or the power equipment, or telecom equipment, Huawei and all that you were talking about. So this is how they were flexible. They were moving, emphasis and focus of their policy rather than getting stuck to one set of policies. Now, with this discussion, I just want to shift gears and go back to what India has been doing, and whether we can relate what happened in India to some of the interventions which were. We know that India followed an import substituting industrialization policy till 1991, when the policy was thrown out of the window, with liberalization brought in by Dr. Manmohan Singh under Prime Minister Narasimha Rao. But this import substituting industrialization, I mean, which was also followed by other East Asian countries, as I was talking earlier, there is a crucial difference. The difference is that India's import substituting industrialization was happening in a closed economy setting. If you look at the 5-year plans, from second 5-year plan onwards to 3, 4, 5, you will find emphasis on import substitution by itself. That was the objective. It was not building local industry which is internationally competitive. It was not the objective. Objective was, we want to build local industry. We want to produce everything we consume ourselves. And it succeeded in that objective. So by the 1980s, India was producing virtually everything. I was earlier talking about, computers, having used computers which were made in India in 1980s. Today you can't. So, so we produce everything, but it lacked international competitiveness. So when the 1991 liberalization began to happen, and it was a gradual one, it was not a shock therapy of overnight. So a lot of local companies stopped producing. They went down under, like Ambassador car, Fiat Padmini car. So many of the products were outdated, not world class, not competitive, and they had to be shut down. So number of industries were shut down. HMT watches, we loved them, but they are not produced anymore. So I think the policy had an objective that it achieved, but you could say that policy objective was slightly not thought through. And maybe it would have been better if we adjusted the policy at some point in 1970s or 80s to bring local production which is competitive. That was not the case. So one can say with hindsight that this was the mistake that we made. But whatever the objective was, that was achieved. So we must give due credit to the policy. The other success or achievement of this policy was that a number of successful enterprises of today had their origin in import substituting industrialization of 1960s, 70s, 80s. Companies like Tata Motors or Hindalco. I've given just two examples, but there are many, many, Titan Industries, so if you begin to list, there are maybe 50, 60 globally active, Indian companies that had their origins in the import substituting industrialization phase of the, development of India. So that was, and then there is a impressive success in select industries like auto, pharma, and software. And I have just a few slides to share what happened in these industries. For instance, in very similar to the East Asian countries, India also in 1970 abolished product patents. It facilitated reverse engineering by local companies, and they used it. The local pharmaceutical industry, used or exploited that provision of abolition of product patents in 1970. So they became among the most competitive producers of generic medicines in the world, and they are 33% of India's pharmaceutical production is actually exported. India is called as the global pharmacy or pharmacy of the world, or poor man's pharmacy. So it has, been documented how Indian vaccines and HIV/AIDS treatment have brought down the costs of treatment in Africa and everywhere else. And other countries, African countries, have actually pleaded that Indian companies should continue to supply the generic medicines. So, so this is one achievement. Uh, the these are some other indicators of success in pharma. I don't want to spend time on this, but I want to share also about how we built a vertically integrated automotive industry. So in 1980s, at the beginning of 1980s, Government of India proactively invited Suzuki Motors to build or produce compact cars in India. Where it imposed a performance requirement, phased manufacturing program, or local content regulation on Suzuki joint venture that you have to generate 75% of local value addition within 6 years. So you just can't be importing components from Japan and assembling them here. So it helped to create a local component industry. So you go to Gurgaon and you visit the Suzuki plant. Around that, you will see hundreds and hundreds of smaller companies which produce gearboxes, piston rings, the seat covers, seats, and wheels, and all that, supplying to Maruti Suzuki plant. So that phased manufacturing program, which is a performance requirement on FDI, help to build locally integrated, vertically integrated auto industry. The other thing I want to talk about is that in 1990s, Ford company came to produce cars in India. They were allowed in, but with a performance requirement that they have to uh, maintain a foreign exchange neutrality. So if they import something, they have to export as much. Okay, so the balance is nil in foreign exchange consumption. So there, you know, they started producing without bothering about this. Then for some approvals, Ford company executive visited Ministry of Industry, and the Ministry of Industry reminded them of this performance requirement that you have to be foreign exchange neutral. So they were, oh my God, this is something they had not thought about, and they were importing a lot of components. So they suddenly got into action what we could export from India. So they invited, representatives of their subsidiary in England, which is called Vistion. Vistion is a component procurer for Ford. So their representatives came and they visited several component producers in India of auto components, and they went around Chennai and different places, and they procured some samples from India. When these samples arrived in their UK plant, Ford's UK plant, somebody I interviewed in Ford UK for a paper I was writing on performance requirements, he said that when the supplies of the samples arrived in the plant, they were astonished to find that the quality of Indian-made components was very good and prices were very affordable. So they said that, oh, we were missing an opportunity. So they sent, several people to go and procure within the country. Then they set up two subsidiaries to just only procure components from India. When they found that Ford was, procuring components in India, their arch rival, GM in US, they also sent their people to procure components in India. And then, Volvo, Daimler, all different majors from auto started to line up, for procuring components in India. So just one single intervention, that you have to be foreign exchange neutral, forced these companies to become to exploit India's potential for component exports. Today, we export more than $20 billion of components alone from India every year. So this happened because of this performance requirement. So I just want to conclude with this, this presentation, and because I want to leave some time for your questions, and there's still some 14, 15 minutes. Uh, you know, as I was saying in the beginning, a manufacturing-oriented structural transformation of India, which India has bypassed, is very much needed to address the challenge of job creation. We have 20 million people joining the workforce in India every year. 12 million people joining the workforce in India every year. We need to find decent jobs for them. And there is no way agriculture can go on supporting that them. And so we need this structural transformation, manufacturing oriented type, for job creation, for reviving growth, which has been going down, and for sustainable management of balance of payments. You often get into these severe current account deficits. And so revival of industrial policy for strategic import substitution, not all import substitution, but selective, strategic, nuanced import substitution of the type I was showing to you or talking to you about in the East Asian type. That is what we need to leverage, and use our domestic market for fostering domestic manufacturing to create jobs, incomes, and save foreign exchange. The East Asian countries offer very valuable lessons in that, harnessing the potential of industry, using strategic interventions and other facilitations. So we need to adopt a strategic approach to harness the potential of manufacturing, leveraging domestic strengths for developing new, efficient products for local and global markets. So, with that, I end here.